On the night of December 16, 1985, a man in a long white trench coat stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car on East 46th Street in Manhattan, walked into a hail of bullets, and changed the American underworld forever. That man was Paul Castellano, the reigning boss of the Gambino crime family, gunned down in front of Sparks Steakhouse by a team of assassins organized by his own underboss, John Gotti. But how did one criminal organization, out of the dozens that had fought for territory across the United States since the early 20th century, accumulate so much power that even its internal wars reshaped the entire landscape of organized crime? To understand why the Gambino family became the most powerful mafia dynasty in America, you have to go back to the chaos before there was any order at all. In the early 1900s, waves of Italian immigrants arrived in New York, crowded into tenements in East Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Brooklyn. Among them were men who had belonged to criminal networks in Sicily and mainland Italy, men who understood extortion, territorial control, and the economics of fear. The streets were ungoverned in any meaningful sense. Police were corrupt, social services were non-existent, and the dominant gangs of the era, Irish and Jewish, held enormous sway. Italian criminals had to carve out space violently. They did. By the 1920s, Prohibition had created the single greatest wealth-generating opportunity in American criminal history, and Italian-American gangsters were positioned to seize it. Bootlegging required supply chains, political connections, enforcement, and above all, coordination. The families that could coordinate best would rise. One family more than any other would prove capable of doing exactly that. The man who laid the first stones of what would become the Gambino Empire was not a Gambino at all. His name was Salvatore D'Aquila, a Sicilian-born mafioso who by the early 1920s led a powerful crime family operating out of East Harlem and Brooklyn. D'Aquila was old-school, authoritarian, rooted in the Sicilian traditions of hierarchy and silence. But D'Aquila overplayed his hand. He declared himself the boss of bosses, a title that made every other family leader his enemy. On October 10, 1928, D'Aquila was shot dead outside his physician's office on Avenue A in Manhattan. The murder was almost certainly ordered by rivals tied to Joe Masseria, a competing boss who wanted total control over New York's underworld. D'Aquila's death kicked off a period of instability that would take years and dozens of bodies to resolve. After D'Aquila's assassination, leadership of his family passed through a series of hands, but one figure soon emerged as the gravitational center. A calculating, patient, deeply strategic man named Carlo Gambino. If you're someone who wants to understand how real power works, not the Hollywood version but the documented institutional version, then this channel is where you want to be. Subscribe now, because every video here pulls back the curtain on the mechanics of organized crime, the decisions, the structures, and the consequences that shaped American history in ways most people never learn about. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24, 1902, in Palermo, Sicily, into a family with deep ties to the local mafia. He arrived in the United States in 1921, reportedly as a stowaway on the SS Vincenzo Florio. He was 19 years old, slight in build, soft-spoken, and unremarkable in appearance. He would become the most powerful mob boss in America, but his rise was not fast. That was the key. While flashier gangsters grabbed headlines and bullet holes, Gambino worked methodically inside the family structure. He earned during Prohibition, running bootlegging operations across Brooklyn. He built relationships across families, connecting with men like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky. He was, by every account, a man who preferred the shadows to the spotlight, and that preference would prove to be his greatest weapon. The pivotal event that shaped the modern mafia and set the stage for the Gambino family's dominance was the Castellamarese War of 1930 to 1931. This was, in essence, a civil war between two factions of Italian-American organized crime in New York, one led by Joe Masseria, the other by Salvatore Maranzano. The war was brutal, messy, and indecisive until a younger generation of gangsters, including Luciano and Gambino, decided to end it by eliminating both bosses. Masseria was killed on April 15, 1931, at a Coney Island restaurant in a hit almost certainly orchestrated by Luciano from within Masseria's own ranks. Maranzano declared himself boss of bosses, reorganized the New York underworld into 5 families, and lasted about 5 months before he too was assassinated on September 10, 1931, in his Park Avenue office by a team of killers allegedly assembled by Lansky and Luciano. The lesson Carlo Gambino took from these bloodbaths was clear. The man who declares himself supreme becomes the target. Real power is exercised from the center, not from the throne. After the dust settled, Lucky Luciano established the Commission, a governing body of the 5 New York families plus representatives from Chicago and Buffalo, designed to mediate disputes, divide territory, and prevent another war. This was the architecture of the modern American mafia, and it is crucial to understand that the Gambino family's eventual dominance was not just about violence. It was about working within this structure more effectively than anyone else. Carlo Gambino understood the Commission. He understood alliances. He understood that in a world where everyone is armed, the most dangerous weapon is information. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the family, then led by Vincent Mangano, operated extensive rackets in the Brooklyn waterfront, labor unions, and the garment industry. The docks were a gold mine. Every ship that came into Brooklyn's ports was subject to a web of payoffs, rigged contracts, and controlled labor. The International Longshoremen's Association was deeply infiltrated, and the Mangano family, with Gambino rising steadily through its ranks, controlled who worked, who got paid, and who got hurt. Albert Anastasia, the family's underboss, was the public face of its violence. Anastasia was feared on a level that is difficult to overstate. He had been instrumental in creating what the press dubbed Murder, Inc., a contract-killing operation that carried out hundreds of hits during the 1930s and 1940s, many of them on behalf of the Commission. Anastasia was the enforcer, Gambino was the strategist, and soon that difference would matter enormously. Here is where the internal dynamics of the family become fascinating. On April 19, 1951, Vincent Mangano vanished. His brother Philip was found dead the same day, shot multiple times and left in the marshes near Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. Albert Anastasia was widely believed to be responsible. He went before the Commission and argued that the Mangano brothers had been planning to kill him first. The Commission, wary of Anastasia's explosive temper but unable to prove otherwise, accepted his claim and allowed him to assume control of the family. Anastasia became boss, but Anastasia was erratic, paranoid, and increasingly reckless. He reportedly ordered the murder of a man he had never met, a Brooklyn salesman named Arnold Schuster, simply because Schuster had helped police identify bank robber Willie Sutton, and Anastasia had seen him being praised on television. Killing civilians was a violation of mafia protocol so serious that it alarmed the entire Commission. Carlo Gambino watched, waited, and planned. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia sat down in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. He closed his eyes. 2 men entered, drew pistols, and fired. Anastasia lunged at his killers, but what he grabbed was his own reflection in the barber's mirror. He died on the floor, wrapped in white towels soaked red. The hit was orchestrated with the blessing of Vito Genovese, another ambitious boss, but it was Carlo Gambino who benefited most. He took control of the family, and from that moment the organization would carry his name. What Gambino did next is what separates him from virtually every other mob boss in American history. He did not declare war. He did not chase headlines. He consolidated quietly. He tightened the family's grip on the garment district in Manhattan, where billions of dollars in clothing were manufactured and shipped. He expanded into construction, waste hauling, food distribution, and trucking. Every major building project in New York, every garbage route in Brooklyn, every shipment of concrete to a job site in Queens was to some degree touched by the Gambino family's influence. The economics were staggering. Federal investigators would later estimate that by the 1970s, the Gambino family controlled or influenced businesses, generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And this was 1970s money. Consider a pattern interrupt here. In 1963, a low-ranking Genovese family soldier named Joseph Valachi became the first made member of the American Mafia to publicly acknowledge its existence. Testifying before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator John McClellan, Valachi described the structure, rituals, and rules of what he called Cosa Nostra. He named names. He drew organizational charts for the first time, the American public. And more importantly, American law enforcement had a blueprint. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had long denied the existence of a national organized crime syndicate. Valachi's testimony made that denial impossible. And yet, even after Valachi, the Gambino family continued to grow. Why? Because Gambino had built something that could absorb shock. His organization was decentralized enough that no single arrest could cripple it, but centralized enough that strategic decisions flowed from one mind. It was, in organizational terms, a masterpiece of criminal engineering. Gambino's power extended far beyond New York. He maintained alliances with families in Philadelphia, New England, Detroit, and Chicago. He had influence over the Bonanno family during its internal turmoil in the 1960s. He was the Commission's most respected voice, not because he shouted the loudest, but because his judgment was consistently sound and his family consistently profitable. He also cultivated political connections with a discipline that rivaled any corporate lobbyist. Judges, city councilmen, union leaders, Port Authority officials, they all understood who Gambino was and what cooperation with him could mean, both as reward and as threat. His network of corruption was not a single bribed official, it was a system, layered, redundant, and deeply embedded in the infrastructure of New York City. Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack on October 15, 1976, at his home in Massapequa, Long Island. He was 74 years old. He had never served a significant prison sentence. He had never been successfully prosecuted for any major crime. He died in his bed, which in mafia terms was the ultimate victory. But his death created a problem. He had chosen his successor, his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, and that choice would eventually tear the family apart. Paul Castellano was a businessman in temperament, a man more comfortable in the boardroom than on the street. He lived in a sprawling mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island, a house so opulent it was nicknamed the White House. He wore tailored suits, ate at fine restaurants, and ran the family's construction and concrete interests with ruthless efficiency. Under Castellano, the Gambino family's hold on New York's construction industry became almost total. The so-called Concrete Club, a cartel of concrete suppliers, controlled by the Commission but heavily influenced by the Gambinos, ensured that every major construction project in New York City paid a mafia tax. The cost was passed on to developers, who passed it on to buyers. Every New Yorker who purchased a condominium or office space in the 1980s was, without knowing it, paying tribute to the Gambino family. Estimates suggest the Concrete Club alone generated tens of millions of dollars in illegal profits, but Castellano's corporate style alienated the family's street-level earners, particularly those in the crews operating in Brooklyn and Queens. One crew in particular, based in the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, was run by a charismatic, hot-tempered captain named John Gotti. Gotti was everything Castellano was not. He was loud, flashy, beloved by his crew, and hungry for more. He resented Castellano's distance from the street. He resented the boss's refusal to share wealth more equitably, and he particularly resented Castellano's edict against drug dealing, an edict that Castellano enforced selectively. Members of Gotti's crew, including his close associate Angelo Ruggiero, were dealing heroin, and Castellano was demanding the tapes of an FBI wiretap that had captured Ruggiero discussing the operation. If Castellano heard those tapes, Gotti knew men would die, possibly including him. So Gotti did what ambitious men in the mafia had always done. He plotted. He secured support from key captains, most notably Sammy Gravano, Frank DeCicco, and Joseph Armoni. He identified Castellano's vulnerabilities, his isolation, his reliance on a small circle of advisors, his daily routine. And then on that December evening in 1985, he had Castellano killed. The execution was brazen. 4 men in trench coats and fur hats waited outside Sparks Steakhouse. Castellano and his underboss, Thomas Bilotti, stepped out of their car. The gunman opened fire at close range. Castellano fell dead on the sidewalk. Bilotti, hit multiple times, collapsed near the car. Gotti himself reportedly drove past the scene, moments later to confirm the kills. It was a coup d'etat, the most dramatic leadership change in mafia history since the Castellamarese War. John Gotti took control of the Gambino family and immediately became the most famous mob boss in America. The tabloids called him the Teflon Don because of his ability to beat charges. He was acquitted 3 times between 1986 and 1990, victories that owed much to jury intimidation, witness tampering, and aggressive defense work by attorney Bruce Cutler. Gotti held court at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, surrounded by bodyguards and admirers. He wore custom suits by Brioni and demanded loyalty with a combination of charisma and menace. His rise coincided with the peak of American public fascination with the mafia, fueled by films like The Godfather and Goodfellas. But Gotti's flamboyance was his fatal flaw. The FBI, under the direction of agents like Bruce Mao and supervisors like James Fox, made the Gambino family their top priority. They bugged the Ravenite, eventually discovering that Gotti held his most sensitive conversations in an apartment directly above the club. There, in that cramped, smoke-filled room, Gotti was recorded discussing murders, extortion, and his contempt for subordinates. The tapes were devastating, and then came the ultimate blow. Sammy Gravano, the family's underboss, and the man who had helped Gotti plan the Castellano hit, flipped. Gravano became a cooperating witness for the federal government, the highest-ranking mafia member ever to do so at that time. He admitted to participation in 19 murders. His testimony provided the framework that prosecutors needed to convict Gotti on 13 counts, including murder, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. On June 23, 1992, John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, where he spent his remaining years in near-total isolation. He died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002. Here's the irony that makes this story so striking. Gotti's conviction did not destroy the Gambino family. It diminished it, certainly, but the infrastructure Carlo Gambino had built was so deeply embedded in the economic fabric of New York that it could not simply be dismantled by removing one boss. The family continued to operate under a series of acting bosses, including Gotti's son, John Gotti Jr., and later Peter Gotti, both of whom were eventually convicted. The family's influence in construction, waste hauling, and waterfront operations was gradually eroded by federal RICO prosecutions, civil suits, and the appointment of court-monitored trustees to corrupt unions. But the erosion took decades, not years. As late as 2008, federal indictments were still targeting Gambino associates for extortion in the New York construction industry. The Gambino family's power was not simply a product of violence, though violence was always the foundation. It was a product of strategic patience, institutional infiltration, and economic sophistication. Carlo Gambino understood something that most criminals, and many legitimate business people, fail to grasp. Sustainable power comes from embedding yourself in systems that people depend on. New York needed construction. It needed garbage collection. It needed functioning ports and trucking routes and garment factories. By controlling access to these essential services, the Gambino family made itself indispensable. Removing them meant disrupting the services themselves, and for decades, neither the government nor the private sector was willing to pay that price. Consider the numbers. At its peak in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Gambino family was estimated to have roughly 250 made members and over 1,000 associates. By comparison, the Genovese family, often considered the best organized and most disciplined of the 5 families, had roughly 200 made members. The Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families were smaller still, but numbers alone do not explain dominance. The Gambino family's advantage was its diversification. While other families relied heavily on 1 or 2 revenue streams, the Gambinos were spread across virtually every major industry in New York. They had their hands in JFK Airport cargo operations, where the infamous 1978 Lufthansa heist, the largest cash robbery in American history at the time, was carried out by associates connected to the family through the Lucchese family's Henry Hill network, a cross-family operation that illustrated the collaborative and competitive dynamics of mafia economics. They controlled private sanitation routes across Staten Island, Brooklyn, and Long Island. They ran loan sharking operations that generated millions in interest. They operated illegal gambling networks that prefigured the modern sports betting industry, and they maintained a disciplined hierarchy that ensured a consistent upward flow of tribute from associate to soldier to captain to boss. What ultimately weakened the Gambino family and the American mafia as a whole was not any single investigation, but a combination of forces. The RICO statute, signed into law in 1970, but not effectively deployed against organized crime until the 1980s under U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani, allowed prosecutors to charge entire criminal enterprises rather than individual acts. This was a paradigm shift. Previously, convicting a mob boss required proving his direct involvement in a specific crime, an almost impossible task given the layers of insulation between the boss and the street. RICO allowed prosecutors to demonstrate a pattern of racketeering activity and hold all members of the enterprise accountable. The 1985 Commission trial, which convicted the bosses of 3 of the 5 families, was the first major demonstration of RICO's power. The Gambino family was represented in that trial, though Castellano was killed before it concluded. The tool that the government had been lacking for decades was finally in its hands, and it would be used relentlessly. At the same time, the cultural code of omertà, the vow of silence that had protected mafia members from prosecution for generations, was breaking down. Valachi had cracked it in 1963. Gravano shattered it in 1991. After Gravano, a flood of cooperators emerged from every family, men who calculated that a decade in witness protection was preferable to life in prison. The Gambino family was particularly affected. Cooperators from within the organization provided detailed testimony about the family's operations, its financial structures, its internal politics, and its murders. Each cooperator made the next prosecution easier and the next cooperator more likely. It was a cascading failure of institutional loyalty. There is also a demographic element that is often overlooked. The mafia's recruitment pool was shrinking. Italian-American communities in New York were assimilating, dispersing to the suburbs, entering legitimate professions. The pipeline of young men willing to enter a life of crime that offered diminishing returns and increasing risk was drying up. Other criminal organizations, Russian, Chinese, Dominican, Mexican, Albanian, were rising to fill the vacuum, often in drug trafficking, a field where the traditional mafia families had been reluctant or selective participants. The underworld was becoming more fragmented, more competitive, and less hospitable to the kind of centralized control the Gambino family had perfected. And yet the legacy of the Gambino family is not simply a story of rise and fall. It is a story about how power works in complex systems. Carlo Gambino did not invent corruption, but he systematized it. He did not create the construction industry's vulnerability to organized crime, but he exploited it with a precision that made his organization virtually indistinguishable from the legitimate economy it parasitized. Paul Castellano, for all his flaws, understood that the family's future lay in white-collar crime, in bid rigging and price fixing and union manipulation, activities that generated enormous profits with relatively low risk of prosecution. Even Gotti, whose recklessness ultimately proved disastrous, demonstrated the power of personal charisma as an organizing principle, the ability to command loyalty, not through fear alone, but through a shared identity, a sense of belonging to something larger and more glamorous than the reality of crime. The Gambino family was the most powerful criminal organization in America because it combined all of these elements: strategic patience, economic diversification, institutional infiltration, calibrated violence, and adaptive leadership into a single, remarkably resilient structure. It thrived for over half a century, survived internal coups and external prosecutions, and embedded itself so deeply in the infrastructure of New York City that its influence took decades to uproot. Even today, law enforcement officials acknowledge that remnants of the Gambino family continue to operate, diminished but not extinct, in construction, waste hauling, and labor racketeering. What the Gambino family story ultimately reveals is something uncomfortable about the nature of power itself. The line between criminal enterprise and legitimate business is not always as clear as we would like to believe. The same skills that made Carlo Gambino a successful mob boss, negotiation, strategic planning, risk management, talent identification, alliance building, are the same skills celebrated in boardrooms and business schools. The difference is not always one of kind, but of degree, and of the willingness to use violence as a final instrument of policy. The Gambino family held a mirror up to the systems it exploited, and the reflection was more familiar than anyone wanted to admit. That is why their story endures, not because they were monsters, though many of them were, but because they understood something fundamental about how the world works, and they used that understanding to build an empire that for a time no one could touch.